Well, Antony Loewenstein joins us now from Sydney, Australia. He's an independent journalist and author of the book, The Palestine Laboratory. Antony, it's really good to have you with us. Thanks for your time. I mean, those fears that we just heard there from the hostage families are not unfounded, are they? Because, you know, we're in such a precarious position right now, but also the way that this ceasefire deal is being proposed in a phased rollout. I mean, if a deal is signed and agreed to, do you expect it to hold?
Well, history would suggest no, and I say that even based on what's happening in Lebanon, the country next door, where Israel's been breaching that ceasefire every day, and indeed they're occupying parts of Syria. Look, the ceasefire, which hopefully happens, in some ways I think a lot of Israelis who would want a deal have reason to be sceptical of their own government. I mean, just in the last 24 hours, Ben-Gvir, one of the far-right members of Netanyahu's government, came out and openly said, proudly, that he had scuttled ceasefire arrangements in months past. So what is on the table now is remarkably similar to what Hamas agreed to 7-8 months ago. There are differences here and there, but essentially Hamas has agreed to this. The issue primarily has been Israel, Netanyahu, not wanting the war to end for his own nefarious reasons. And what's so outrageous is that, in fact, the death toll amongst Israeli soldiers in Gaza is going up. There's been 4, 5, 6 soldiers being killed every week, and obviously even worse, hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian civilians continue to be killed. And just finally, in the last 24 hours, you had the outgoing Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in the US, acknowledging remarkably and outrageously that Hamas has essentially replenished all its fighters that had been lost in the last 15 months. The obvious question is, what's been the reason the war has been going on then for so long? To achieve what exactly?
In terms of this timeline that Chrissy was talking about, there's some cynicism, isn't there, in Israel that will even get past the first stage of it. And this has all been calculated by, you know, those right-wingers as well. You know, it's a bit of a compromise. You get to the first stage, but you don't continue.
Well, the Israeli press has been saying in the last 24 hours that one of the apparently carrots, so to speak, that the Trump administration has offered Netanyahu is a few things. One, you can break the ceasefire deal in the coming weeks and months if you really want to or need to. The possibility of being able to massively expand and annex parts of the West Bank, and violence there against Palestinians has been off the chart for the last months. And also to remove the sanctions on Pegasus, which is an Israeli spyware tool that I've spent years investigating that Israel wants to keep selling to authoritarian states. So that's apparently the carrot that the Trump administration has offered to Israel. But ultimately, in the end, what a lot of Israelis, I think, are thinking, I'm talking about the ones who are not pro-war, is what exactly have we achieved? Hamas is still standing. They are bloodied and beaten, to be sure. Their leaders have been killed, but as a fighting force, they are now a guerrilla army. They're no longer a government of Gaza, but they still control parts of Gaza. And I think ultimately, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Antony. I didn't mean to interject there.
No, I was just going to say, and I think increasingly you find in some Israeli discourse that you have all these reports in the Israeli press, which often don't get attention in the Western press, of Israeli soldiers themselves talking about the gross human rights abuses, the war crimes they've been committing in Gaza, killing civilians for no reason. That's their words. And I think ultimately what I think a lot of Israelis are worried about is that when international journalists and NGO workers and others can get access to Gaza, they will see that the death toll, which is apparently at least 45,000, probably tens of thousands more than that, is so devastating. To achieve what, apart from mass destruction of Gaza?
I just wanted to ask Antony, on that point of that stunning admission you mentioned about Antony Blinken yesterday, he also talked about his vision for the future governance of, of the state, saying that Israel would have to accept reuniting Gaza and the West Bank under the leadership of the reformed Palestinian Authority. I mean, given what we've just said about the replenishing of Hamas fighters, I mean, that's pie in the sky, isn't it? That is so unlikely to be agreed on by Israel, and that is part of this ceasefire deal being proposed.
Yeah, it's a pipe dream. I mean, not least in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority has spent the last months literally going after and fighting Israel's occupation, which essentially is its job, killing huge amounts of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. The idea that Gazans are going to want to have the PA as their leaders is delusional. I mean, what I fear is there'll be some kind of Arab-style autocratic regime a combination of various states maybe putting in some money. But to rebuild Gaza will take decades. And without accountability for war crimes committed, particularly by Israeli leaders and soldiers and others, nothing will change. Without impunity ending for Israel, this situation, I fear, will just fester for years, especially with Trump administration coming in.
Antony Loewenstein, appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you so much for joining us from Sydney.
Thanks for having me.